Song is a wonderful memory device.
This is a whole intellectual technology that we in the modern world have lost sight of.
The way evolution has set this up is amazing. It may save your life. There are so few Indigenous elders around that can still help us see this way of looking at it.
What can we learn from ancient stories? Turns out, a lot. In this episode, we'll explore origin stories from around the world as we seek to answer where we came from. Big questions, no easy answers. Dive into the mysteries of the universe with Unknowns. From the secrets of the Big Bang to the future of humanity, discover what we still don't know. Tune in and explore the unknown. Hi, I'm Kim Lochner and I'll be your Unknowns guide. Our host is David Christian, a historian, the founder of Big History, and the host of the Unknowns podcast. And our guest today is Lynn Kelly, a research fellow at La Trobe University and an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. Lynn has written a lot about some of our first origin stories, which were passed down orally across many generations by Indigenous peoples around the world. And one of the biggest questions we have about these stories is how they were able to pass down and preserve so much information without a written language.
My research is about that, what you're referring to, the vast amounts of information, in particular scientific information, which is often not credited to Indigenous cultures. They wouldn't have survived unless they had this massive, pragmatic, useful information. So the stories tend to start at a cave or a mountain or some significant place where ancestral beings left and moved across the landscape. And as they did, they named every location. And that becomes really useful for memory. They named all the animals and the plants. So this is laying down a foundation for higher levels of knowledge that they're going to add about the details of the animals and the plants and the locations and everything else. It's all laid down and grounded really strongly in the landscape or the skyscape. And that matches the way the human brain optimizes memory. People must be moving across that landscape often. So you hear people talk about Indigenous cultures as nomadic. Nomadic is wandering and moving. But most of the cultures that I've worked with, and they're in Australia, this dates back 65,000 years, but the stories that date back 10, 20,000 years, they're mobile, not nomadic. So they're moving from location to location or even staying still, but they know that landscape incredibly well and information is associated with every significant feature in it.
Lynn, I think until recently, very few people understood how much information could be held in Indigenous origin stories. So why do you think Western scholars have had such a sort of limited understanding of what can be contained in those stories?
I think it's because of the methods that are used. The stories are mythological. They have all these vivid characters, and Western scholars didn't recognise that these were anything more than fairy tales, that in fact they're encoding huge amounts of information. But what they were told were the stories that would be told to children, because the higher levels of the stories are only told to those who are initiated into them, which is one of the ways of keeping them accurate. And so they just were not recognising the stories, and a whole lot of other methods that we'll talk about were actually encoding huge amounts of scientific information. It's very recently that this has been acknowledged.
So you say that a lot of Indigenous people kept secrets from anthropologists and ethnographers.
Absolutely. Human memory is flaky. Yet we have evidence of stories that go back 10,000 years or more accurately. And the reason this is possible is secrecy and restricting information to people who repeat it and keep checking it. And that's what happens as higher and higher levels of initiation. So if you tell all the details of the stories, the stuff on survival depends, to everyone, it's going to be corrupted and the population will just die out. So they have this restricted information, and the elders that are right at the top, fully initiated, hold the most detailed information about how to survive, like For example, if we have a drought and all the stuff we usually eat is not available, that berry over there will get you through. We don't normally eat it because it tastes horrible, but if you observe it and eat it, you will survive. Don't touch the one over there, no matter how hungry you are. That sort of information you don't want to get wrong. So it's held at very highly restricted levels and checked and checked. That's not told to anthropologists. They are only told the childlike stories, and that's why the indigenous stories we hear tend to sound like fairy tales, like what we tell children. In terms of those cultures, we are children.
Now, Lynn, how did they hold so much knowledge? I mean, particularly you mentioned the berries. So this is knowledge that you wouldn't use every day. It doesn't
Absolutely.
but it's somehow retained. You talk a lot in your work about mnemonics, which, as I understand it, are special memory techniques, special ways for locking ideas in your memory. How do they work?
We know simple mnemonics like My Very Earnest Man, Just Show Us Nature's Path, which is what I learnt when Pluto was still a planet. So to remember the planets, they're very, very simple and will work at a very early level. But to do masses of information, you want a whole lot more. The human brain has evolved for stories to work really well, especially if they have very vivid characters. So they're either hugely ugly or terribly beautiful. Lots of sex and violence. I'm sorry to have to say that, but sex and violence makes stories memorable. So the stories, all that stuff around the story encodes the actual information that mustn't be forgotten. So then we add the next level of memory, which is song. Music is highly memorable. I'm sure those watching here will remember the songs they learnt as young children and still remember them now, even if they don't hear them for years. Song is a wonderful memory device. Then you go up to dance. If you add movement into it, made that even more memorable again. Then you add the place, the fact that we locate all the information because the brain really works well on that. And then we add even the stuff that amazes me most is these objects because they're added in. So what they're using is a combination of all the things that the brain ultimately uses and which our viewers can use today. They've still got that brain. These skills have been sidelined.
Do these memory techniques still survive in some form in modern culture? I mean, I'm thinking of Superman comics, for example, where you've got these really exaggerated characters, like the characters from the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Well, the Odyssey and the Iliad moves across locations. It's mapped on because it was originally oral and told over night after night after night from memory. So they were using a landscape just like an Aboriginal songline and a Native American pilgrimage trail. But there are no real experts left in these anymore. There were very recently. In terms of Australian Aboriginal cultures, yes, and that's why we can learn so much. So the equivalent of a restricted object like a Lukasa in Australia is a chiringa, and they are still used. So it would be completely inappropriate for us to use that sort of thing. And that's why there is so much we can learn from our Indigenous colleagues on how to optimise our memories, and we need to learn it while they're still there, while we recently start respecting that information.
So this is a whole intellectual technology that we in the modern world have lost sight of.
Absolutely. It is a technology. It's a learning technology, information technology. So music is an information technology, song and story, but we've sidelined them more to entertainment because we've got writing. Art, these are an art form, and there's a whole range of art forms used. We're storing knowledge, but we've moved that to gallery walls. We've put the musicians up on the stage. We've taken away these skills, and the wonderful thing is that we can use them in schools and universities now without losing anything because our brains are still encoded for them. And we can have writing as well.
So we think of these objects as art, whereas they are art, but they are also fantastic stores of information.
Exactly. Defining art is impossibly hard. I use the definition from Ian Davidson, Australian archaeologist. It's when humans make deliberate marks for deliberate reasons. that's art. Therefore, I don't have to get into all the other stuff. So absolutely they're art, but the purpose of art was knowledge.
In the Big History course, we talk about collective learning. It's the point at which our species began to share colossal amounts of information. Now, what sort of links do you see between this information technology and collective learning?
These technologies are used for the whole group. So the elder that's the expert on it will be sharing the information depending on what level of initiation you're in. But as a group, so when the gatherings and performances, so the indication in the archaeology is performance sites. Performance is a way of exchanging information. It is the most effective way. You remember a performance way better than you remember a printed sheet. So it is the group learns as a group. Now, this then gets optimized. The way evolution has set this up is amazing. These gatherings are the way information is stored and then conveyed and shared collectively. And what's amazing is that evolution has carefully put into human populations diversities that optimize this. So you've got your performers who are dancing and singing, but they're taking in information galore and adding it all into their performances. So you've got people that are on the ADHD spectrum because we are dependent on them. These are performance-based knowledge systems. But in order to keep information really accurate, we have to have people who are going to store the information, don't like change, repeat it and concentrate on details. We need people who are on the autism spectrum. We are also dependent on people who are dyslexic. The research shows that people with dyslexia have incredibly strong spatial skills. They can navigate and won't get lost. They can construct things in their minds. They can take materials and create constructions and rotate them and make sure they're stable. So they are absolutely essential. And for the art that we've been talking about, you'll find a lot of dyslexic people in architecture and art. So there's a whole lot of other diversities too, but they're the big ones that if you look at in terms of indigenous knowledge systems, evolution has kept those in, and they're in every population all over the world. They're not deteriorating, which you would expect if they were a disorder. They are not a disorder. They are a diversity that in combination are absolutely sensational.
So for collective learning to work, given these wonderful information technologies, you need a diversity of neurological skills, of different ways of thinking.
Yes, you want the permanence to get the long term and to keep that berries and all the things you must know. But if you're going to adapt, you need to be taking in new information. There's also lots of other neurodiversities. But those three in combination give you an optimized population with all the others. So evolution has carefully done this, and what we call disorders are actually diversities that are hugely valuable used in combination.
Wonderful. Can I shift ground slightly?
Absolutely.
And ask, why do you think all human cultures that we know of have been interested in origin? So this is a question about why. Origin stories seem to be universal to all human communities.
There's been an assumption that we clever Europeans are interested in the cosmology and everything because it hasn't been recognised in indigenous. They are humans. Humans want to know stuff. And so you find Australian Aboriginal and Native American Pueblo, their astronomy is incredibly strong. And they're asking the same questions. They ask them slightly differently. And what they do is store the information differently. So, for example, in Colorado, you've got Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock is used by the ancestral Pueblo people, was used to show when the lunar cycle, the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle occurred. Now, just think about what they had to do in order to recognise that. They had to be recording the behaviour of the moon over at least 18.6 years in memory and watching for those patterns. The human brain is a pattern-seeking device. And so why did they do it? The lunar standstill doesn't really serve any practical purpose because they want to know. All humans have that curiosity. I still can't fathom how they could possibly have achieved that. But they placed the great house in exactly the right position. There is no doubt about exactly what they were doing. It's phenomenal.
I remember reading that stories about Orion and stories about the Seven Sisters who are being chased by this man right across Australia and then up into the sky. At least two of the stars involved in Betelgeuse and is it the Pleiades or near the Pleiades?
Yeah, Pleiades.
Were actually variable stars. And the stories encode information about the fact that they're variable stars, which was something that was discovered in Western astronomy after it was known in indigenous astronomy.
Lot of events dating back a long time, because way back 10,000 years ago, there were 7 visible stars. There aren't now, it's only 6 yet in the Pleiades. But you've got stories all over the world that have this chasing type thing with 7 sisters or 7 characters. So all the different cultures were noting 7 stars, even though there's only 6 now, which tells us that these stories are really, really old. And the Seven Sisters one in Australia goes right across the whole continent between umpteen different language groups. So they are communicating across different languages because they all spoke their neighbouring languages as well. And you get the same thing all over the world.
How this very powerful mnemonic technology, how old is the information that can be stored in this technology? I mean, even if they don't actually have precise chronologies, what is the oldest information they can retain?
Well, we don't know. You said it's all about the unknowns. We don't know because we can only learn from the elders that we can talk to now, and there are very few around the world that are still retaining the old stories because the young people don't want to. We know of stories around the world that date back over 10,000 years because they tell about sea level rises. So we get
at the end of the last ice age.
Yes. So we get these stories from the Tlingit with the Haida and Tsimshian cultures in southeast Alaska that have these stories about the sea level rises, and we have the same stories here. So we know they're at least 10,000 years old. There's volcanic eruption stories here. Now, skeptics, and I am skeptical, I'm scientific, you have to have a level of skepticism, will say that somehow they may be recognising that a volcanic eruption happened by something they can see. Except the stories from Northern Australia date back on volcanic eruptions to 50, 60,000 years ago. There are no stories of eruptions that we know happened before they were here. The evidence is robust that they are storing these stories. So they'll do astronomical things that you mentioned, volcanic, land, sea. They're all stored. We know about 10,000 years. It's highly likely we will start to, if we listen, that they'll go back further. But 10,000 years? That's
fantastic.
Extraordinary.
Fantastic. Lynn, what is in your latest book, you talk about the genetic basis for these memory techniques, because it seems to be pretty clear that all humans have these abilities and other closely related species don't have them or don't have enough of them to work these information technologies. So how would you describe the genetic basis for these skills?
So you've got art and music. We know that they're innate because they're universal and they are uniquely human. The only explanation is that they are genetically encoded. So we have an advantage that's been given through evolution because we can learn and store information in the way no other species can. And it's art and music, connection to place. You don't see other animals using spatial, although chickadees do a bit, but you won't ever get this combination that has been put into the human species.
So genes create the potential for these, but culture plays a huge role in the specific way they develop. I mean, the evolution of the Lukasa or the of other memory techniques.
Yes, so the Lukasa works the same as the Australian Chiringa. They're slightly different. If you look at music, this is one that really, not musical, really confused me. But it turns out that there's a thing called the perfect fifth, which is a combination of music. I won't go into the music theory, but all music works on that. So whether they've got a scale with 32 notes in it or 8 or the pentatonic with 5, that's why it might sound different. but the fundamental of rhythm and these scales within them are universal. And so that potential is genetically encoded, and then the way it's developed becomes the culture. So really little kids will move to music the same, they'll draw art the same, they'll learn places the same, but then it becomes culturally driven, which gives us a diversity that's wonderful.
I wonder if I could go back to the question of science. From what you're talking about, the sort of information that gets preserved using this information technology and that's necessary for survival, why do modern scholars resist using the word science to describe the origin stories and the knowledge present in indigenous society?
I'm not sure, and I grew up my whole life, my field, physics and maths and things, I grew up my whole life thinking of them as Western. The definition of science that I prefer to use is something that is testable and repeatable by different individuals. So let's take a couple of examples. The cycad plant in Australia is deadly poisonous. You do not want to eat it. But if it's treated over 5 days of leaching and all sorts of a process...
This is quite a complex process.
Oh, yes. At least 5 days, it becomes the foundation of really good protein-based bread-type stuff. And they use it for massive gatherings. So how they learnt that worries me. But you don't want to retest that theory generation after generation, and yet it's used everywhere. If we go up to the north, including Southeast Alaska and right across the north, there's a little bird called the loon or the diver. It's a fairly nondescript bird, but it has a really piercing call. When birds are out at sea and the storm comes in, some birds stay out at sea, but the loon will always come back to land and it will call the whole way. So what the fishermen do before they go out to sea is they perform a song and a story about the loon. There's totem poles with the loon on it. It's a very important ancestor within the stories and songs. They perform that song, making sure that they have got that call firmly in their head. Storm out at sea, make sure you identify that and follow it back. You mightn't get back to where you want to get, but you'll get back to land. It may save your life. That's science.
What I was thinking of was that when you begin a flight, you're given instructions on what to do when there's a disaster. Yes. And it's as if you're describing exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's science. It's based on evidence, repeated evidence, and checked by various people, and it works for everyone. It's science.
So this is a vast amount of knowledge that is in danger of being lost because we, with our modern minds, as powerful as they are, struggle to really see this information.
You've also got to struggle for the elders, because this is restricted information. That's how they kept it so accurate, and we're asking for it, even though we're not initiated. Yep. So you've got this real battle that they've got to work through. Do they share this information and break all their cultural taboos, which has kept it so strong anyway, or do they not, and the information's lost? It's a moral dilemma that I don't know the answer to.
Lynn, can I shift ground slightly? And this series of podcasts is about mysteries, about things we don't fully understand. What would you say are still the big mysteries in your mind about traditional or indigenous origin stories?
I think that even though I've been working on this for 15 years, I've only scratched the surface of how this works. I've been trying it all myself, and my natural memory is incredibly poor. But using these techniques, I can memorize anything. And what I want to understand much more is how that's all layered from the base level of information, how information is layered higher and higher. So, for example, the Pueblo I mentioned, anesthetics, they use datura as a plant as an anesthetic. But how do they actually store that? How did they learn that? The astronomy, I'm working quite a lot with ethnoastronomy, it's stored differently. They have the same information about the stars because that's fixed. Everybody looks at the stars and sees the same thing, but they'll also see things differently. So, for example, they'll look at the scintillation and the different way lights around
stars
twinkle. And from that, they know the weather because it's related to the moisture in the atmosphere. And they'll use that to tell when weather's changing. So for in New Guinea, when to plant taro, their main crop. So they are integrating information. And I think we're still too much in our silos. And this is where big history is so different. I was in an engineering silo and then a physics silo, and I've realised I'm still really struggle to integrate it and to layer information higher and higher. And the more I do it, the more astounded I become by what I'm learning. And it really worries me that there are so few Indigenous elders around that can still help us see this way of looking at it.
What fascinates me, what I find mysterious, is how old is this technology? And one thing I think we can say for certain, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that this sort of way of holding information is a much, much older technology. It existed and it served humans for most of human history, because writing is quite a recent invention, just 5,000 years old. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. You've got to look for the combinations. So if you look for the combination of music and art, so in the caves, you can see that music and art were linked. The art was placed at positions of absolute resonance. And this is not only our species, we've got it for Neanderthals too. So there's evidence of them using music and art, but the evidence is still pretty scant. But at least 40,000 years. Now, if it's 40,000 years that we've been using art and music together in spaces, it had to develop. You don't just suddenly put the whole package together. So you must go back further and further for when humans started to realise that music helped them store information. There's some argument, it's not robust yet, that music predates language. And there are African tribes that use drum language to communicate without words, and it's not just rhythms. They are communicating information accurately. So this package, if we can date it to 40,000 years ago, which I can do all over the world, it must go much earlier for it to develop. But the thing that you start to see, the transition, so you've got art and it appears in panels, essentially blackboards. The longest one I've ever come across is in Utah, 72 kilometres. 72 kilometres of rock art.
Amazing.
That is a blackboard. That is education. So in China, you can trace the whole thing through. So you've got these great long panels. Then they started developing them as scrolls, long image scrolls, and the script starts appearing, which you can see right from those early shells and things, the oracle shells. And the thing with China is that writing didn't become widespread until the 1950s. There were still performers, they were called folk performers, who told all the news and the stories, and people with living memory can remember when those methods were still being used in China.
In fact, universal literacy is very recent all around the world, isn't it?
Yeah, so if you
that means that these technologies were being used by huge numbers of people until quite recently.
If you look at the medieval cathedrals and medieval manuscripts, they were designed this way. The manuscripts used art in order to make every page memorable.
Lynn, we've spent a lot of time talking about differences between modern ways of thinking about the world and holding knowledge and indigenous, ancient or indigenous ways of holding knowledge. But surely beneath the surface there are huge numbers of similarities as well, aren't there?
Absolutely. In the past, books and stories about Indigenous people always emphasised the exotic and what was different. But in fact, what we're starting to see is humans are all the same. We all want to know where we came from. What's the big picture? These questions. And so I think that's really important that we see that humanity and what makes us human is universal. It's innate, it's ancient, and we need to benefit from that as individuals and as communities.
Thanks for sharing these amazing stories, Lynn. I definitely need to learn some of these memory techniques that were used by ancient Indigenous people. Check out our next episode, which moves us from talking about the past to focusing on our future and the potential for alien life in the universe. Check out the other episodes of Unknowns where we explore mysteries and questions about our origins and our future. Interested in learning more about Big History? Check out the Big History Project, a free online course for middle school and junior high students.